Today I'm going to open up the bottom end of the MD engine. We're going to pull the oil pan off and pull the pistons out. We can inspect the pistons, the sleeves, and the engine bearings. Alrighty, here we go. Well, you ready for the big reveal? This is at least 40 years since anybody's looked in this engine, and it may well have never been touched since it was new 70 years ago. There's surprisingly little sludge in the oil pan. I'm pretty amazed by that. All right, what do we got in here? This is the oil pump pickup. This is the oil pump. Real simple design, just two gears that run against each other and push oil through and around the gears to put up oil pressure for the engine. These are each rod bearings connected to the piston. There's 4 of them in a row there. And then between each rod bearing is a main bearing. That's the crankshaft bearing right here, here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And that's one of the principal differences with a regular M engine. You would only have 3 main bearings. You'd have 1 on each end and 1 in the middle here. But on a diesel, you've got 2 more so that they're between each piston and cylinder. There's not much else to see here until we take the rod bearings off and look and see how the crankshaft journals are and the bearings themselves. Before I pull the pistons, I want to take these ridges off the top of the sleeves so that the rings don't catch on them. Remember, I want to try and reuse these pistons if I can. This is a ridge reamer, and it is very handy to have. This is from my dad's shop, and I got to get it out to the size of the cylinder, and then I can use it to ream off that ridge. That's why they call it a ridge reamer. Once I have it set into the bore, I spin it, and there's a cutting edge on it. And when it spins easy, I just tighten it up a little bit. There we go. Spin it again. And after multiple tightenings and turnings, I get it down to this, where the carbon's all gone, and I'm just left with the metal lip, which is fairly significant on these sleeves. A little disappointing. To pull the pistons, the first step is to bend back these tabs, which keep the bolts from accidentally rotating. Alright, now we can take the bearing caps off. Might need the breaker bar for that, I guess so. Oh man, I might need the pipe on the breaker bar for that. Wowie! I can't believe they're that tight. Yeah, there we go. Come on, Neil. That is one huge bearing. It's not all scraped up. I like to see that. Here's what the rod journals look like on the crankshaft. That is pretty darn good. I'm going to use a wooden block to tap the pistons up and out. Oh, there goes the bearing. It's okay. Feels like it's out. Let's see. There she is. Well, it didn't take long to find bad news. This is the number 2 piston that I just pulled. First one. Remember, we saw that little dimple on the top when it was in the bore? Well, that's what caused it right there. And the ring was broken, this top ring. You can see this piece of ring's jammed in here. There's no way that I can reuse that piston. It's too bad because it has almost no wear on it aside from that. You know, this is where you'd see the wear because the piston slaps back and forth this way. And that is definitely a decent piston except for that little accident right there. Oh man, that is awful. Well, nothing to do but keep going. Let's pull another one. There. Same thing happened. You know, that carbon grinds down in there and eventually gets caught and builds up, and when the piston's coming down. That is a shame. Fortunately, the bearings don't look too bad, and Actually, I know now the last time that the engine was overhauled, because these are Cleveite bearings and they were made in June of 1965. Usually replacement bearings are marked with the date of manufacture. So I know sometime around 65, and this tractor's 1950. The motor was rebuilt and they don't look bad. For those of you not familiar with rebuilding engines, you always want to make sure that the pistons go back in the same bores that they're in, and as well as the piston rod, which is this assembly. They're usually numbered, and these are. There's a 3 on this tab on this one, and then you want to make sure that the rod cap goes on the same piston that it was on, same piston rod. This one's also marked number 3. You match them up, and that's the orientation of the rod. Usually this fat end will face toward the camshaft on the engine, and it does in this case, so that way you know to put them in this way. That's all very important when rebuilding an engine. I'm surprised with all the damage to those pistons that the sleeves are so clean. You'd expect to see a scrape where the piston had come off, but I'll show you. Looking down here, there aren't any scores on the cylinder walls from all that damage. Pretty shiny, except where I ran the ridge reamer around it. Now let's see if I can turn this over to get it down. Take the other 2 pistons down. Oh, come on, baby. Well, we'll try this. I know it's free because when we pulled it in, it turned a little bit. The engine was free, just a little stubborn, so now I can pull the 2 other pistons and we can see the extent of the disaster. Well, let's see what number 1 looks like. Another busted ring. This one was carboned the worst of any of them. Yeah, see, that ring's all busted up. It's bound up in there. No wonder it had so much blow by. Look at how that ringland is worn from the ring rotating in it after it broke. Bad, bad, bad. There we go. Number 4. Look at that. Massive damage. Hey, I gotta laugh if I'm not gonna cry, right? I'll cry later, off camera. The next step is to evaluate the bearing clearances of the rod and main bearings on the crankshaft. And to do the rod bearings, first I'm going to disassemble one of the pistons, and this is piston number 1. There we go. Take the cap off. And here we have bearing. Now these don't look too bad, as I said, but we'll find out. And if I look in my I&T manual for the MD, I can find out what the tolerances are for the rod bearings. Connecting rod and bearings, 0.0023 to 0.0033. So that's basically 2 to 3 thousandths, which is the closest I can measure. Here's how I measure bearing clearances. I take a dab of engine assembly grease because it's sticky, and then I'm using Plastigauge. This Plastigauge is for 0.04 to 0.009 inches clearance, so I know if I am greater than 0.04, then I'm out of the tolerances that are spec'd for this engine. If I'm less than 0.04, then I'm in good shape. I'll just take a piece of this. You put it across the bearing inside, and now we'll put the rod and bearing back in the engine. Put this in from the top the way it came out, and remember the tab faces the camshaft side of the engine. Slide her down and very carefully set it on the crankshaft journal so that I don't scratch anything. Okay, I need to look up the connecting rod torque values so I can get the bearing cap torque to the proper value. Oh, where am I? Ah, here we go. Main bearing bolt torque. No, those are main bearings. Connecting rod bearings. Series M and 6 diesels, 115 foot-pounds. Okay, plastic gauge in there. Tighten it down a little bit. I think these things run tighter than 115 foot-pounds. Put the torque wrench on it, set to 115 foot-pounds. Tighten them down equally. There's one. There's two. And then take it right back off. And look at the plastic gauge. So the plastic gauge stuck to the connecting rod. Let me get a paper towel. Let's wipe this off. You can see the plastic gauge there. It got squished as it's supposed to. If it didn't get squished, I'd be really worried about the clearances. And you use this mark on the wrapper to measure. And the fattest line is .004, the fat blue line. And I'm right about at it. I'm fatter than the .005. I'm about .004, which means that these bearings are pretty close to being within tolerance. I'll pull that piston rod back out, and then we'll do the same for the crank main bearings. For some reason, the main bearings are locked on with castle nuts and cotter pins, while the rod bearings had those bent over plates holding the nuts in place. She looks pretty good. Here's the cap off that main bearing. Wow, there is some material in that. Holy cow. This bearing does not look as in good shape as the rod bearings, where it looks like some grit, dirt, whatever got in there and scored it. The crankshaft didn't look bad, but the bearing doesn't look so good. It's got a date on it. Let's see. Isn't that funny? These bearings were made in July of 1974. Standard means they're not undersized bearings or oversized, however you want to think about it. They're just standard, and these are International Harvester bearings, whereas the other ones were Cleveite. Yeah, that didn't look so good. Well, let's check the clearance anyway. Same with main caps. There should be a mark on the side that faces the camshaft. Oh, there's the mark, number 2. And that is indeed number 2. We just want to check and make sure that the numbers on the other ones, right there, 3 and 4, are on the camshaft side. So we put this bearing with the number 2 toward the camshaft. Torque value on these is 150 to 175 foot-pounds, so I'm tightening them to 160. Here's what we got, and here's our measure. That again is rated about 4 thousandths, which is just a touch above the tolerances in the I&T manual. Well, that all was a little discouraging. I can't believe that the tractor ran as long as it did with the pistons in such bad shape. It looks like it's at least going to need new pistons and sleeves, and the bearings I'm on the fence about. This tractor's a lot different from a regular M. If I were rebuilding the engine in a regular M, I could get a piston and sleeve set for about $350 for all 4 holes. I could get a complete rebuild kit with gaskets, pistons, sleeves, bearings, rings, everything I needed pretty much for less than $1,000. But with this engine, they're not making parts anymore. There's not enough of them around to stimulate aftermarket producers to make parts. So The parts you can find are either custom made, and they're super expensive, or they're new old stock, which is parts that were made originally by International and have just remained either on dealer shelves or in private hands. And I have found some new old stock piston and sleeve sets for this. This is a 4-inch bore engine. It's been brought to the larger bore through thinner sleeves. I can buy a 3 7/8 inch bore piston and sleeve set for all 4 holes for $1,350. Regular M350, MD $1,350. That's representative of what I'm going to pay for all the other parts if I can find them. Like I keep saying, they're hard to find. M parts are easy to find. MD parts, not easy to find. So I'm going to have to think about it. I'm going to have to sleep on it at the very least and try and decide what I want to do. I'll have to talk to Hillary about it. You know, it makes me wish that the old family tractor, which this is, was an M rather than MD. If this were a regular M, there'd be no doubt in my mind. I'd pull the engine out completely and go all the way through it. This being an MD, the money starts to scare me, so I'm going to have to think about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was interesting, even though the news wasn't good, and I'll see you next time.